So you ever, like when you're online just scrolling and stuff, you ever just stop and think about all those people, like all those communities out there? Like, how do we even begin to understand them? It's kind of wild, right? Well, today we're going to dive deep into something called digital ethnography, which sounds super fancy, but it's actually really interesting. And these lecture notes we've been looking at have just been mind-blowing.
You know what's really cool about it?
Yeah.
It's the whole core idea of ethnography itself. It's all about connecting with like the way a community thinks, the way they live their lives, just through watching, through observation. It's kind of like learning to see their world through their eyes.
Yeah, totally. And there's actually like different ways to do that. We've been reading about this idea of obtrusive methods, which is like really immersing yourself, going all in, almost becoming part of a community, versus the unobtrusive kind, where you're more of an observer from a distance. And like our notes mentioned this guy, Tara Saber, whose work is a great example of that immersive style, while Miriam's research on online communities leans more towards the unobtrusive side using digital methods, but she mixes it up sometimes with more traditional ethnographic elements too.
And get this, if you break down the word ethnography itself, it tells you even more. Ethno comes from Greek, and it means like people, folk, or nation even. And then ethnography, that means field of study. So basically, ethnography is the study and description of cultures.
Right. So now fast forward to today where we've got these huge cultural groups forming and changing, but it's all happening online. How does that change things for the traditional way of doing ethnography? I mean, it can't be just copy and paste, can it?
Definitely not. Miri actually puts it really well. She says that digital ethnography is about the study of this intersection between human relationships and technology. It's not just about individual behavior online, but the social dynamics of the whole internet, how it all plays out on a societal level. And one really crucial thing our sources pointed out is that in digital ethnography, the internet and social media are the very tools you use for investigation, which means that these platforms, their algorithms, all of that stuff shapes the digital landscape and influences online behavior just as much as individual choices. It's a big difference compared to traditional offline ethnography.
And this is where it gets really interesting because we have to think about the internet itself, right? How it's evolved. The impact of digital media on cultural studies is unprecedented, it says. Think about the early internet. It was supposed to be this open space for sharing knowledge, but now it's all about what they call capitalist accumulation rather than just commercialism. That's a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. The focus has shifted. It's not just about selling products online anymore. It's all about getting that user data and turning it into profit. So when you're doing digital ethnography, you have to be so aware of the environment you're studying, the internet itself, and the people, the corporations who control it. You got to think less about ads and more about how our data is the product, and that shapes everything from what we see in our feeds to how we're targeted by political campaigns.
It's true. And then there's this whole idea of embeddedness in digital media. It's not just some neutral platform, is it?
Exactly. Everything about it,
Yeah.
the politics, the culture, the way society works, the way information flows, even the physical infrastructure that makes it all possible, all of that comes together to shape the digital landscape we're looking at.
And it's huge, like the scale of it all. Our notes talk about how big tech has streamlined culture, maybe even made it kind of homogenous in a way. They use Meta as an example because it's got something like 3.24 billion users worldwide across all their platforms. It's crazy. And when you've got these platforms designed for a specific purpose, in Meta's case, to make money, well, those design choices influence our interactions, and that contributes to this feeling that the online experience is becoming more and more uniform. It's like you can see how certain trends and formats take over when you're scrolling through your own social media feeds.
So then we have to look at the whole issue of power dynamics, right? The internet's commercial structure creates these hierarchies, and digital ethnography
Yeah.
becomes super important for figuring out how all of that plays out within communities online, organizations, basically any social group. It helps us see who's got the influence, who's getting their voice amplified, and who's being left out.
This was a really interesting point, I thought, the whole idea of decolonization in ethnography. Our sources say that Miriam believes the field has only just begun to address its colonial past. So how does that apply to studying online communities?
It's about really looking at things from the perspective of the people who've been marginalized or oppressed. History has often been written by the people in power, and that affects how we understand society and culture. So from a decolonization viewpoint, we need to take a critical look even at the work of those big names in anthropology like Margaret Mead, Franz Boas, and Bronislaw Malinowski. We have to acknowledge that they were working within existing power structures, and that shaped their views. They created this idea of the natives from a position of authority, and while their work is important, we can't ignore the historical context.
So it's realizing that the way we've traditionally viewed cultures both offline and now online could be skewed by those power dynamics, which leads to the idea of technology itself as a potential colonization force. That's a pretty powerful statement.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is this historical connection between technology and how it's used to maintain those power structures.
Hmm.
I mean, think about it. Technology and defense and warfare, they go way back together. The rise of the nation state is connected to how technology made things more efficient. Everything from getting resources to production to building those supply chains for domination, it all changed how power worked.
The example of the British Empire and those undersea cables to India really shows that, right? On the surface, it looks like they just wanted to improve communication, but the source points out that it was much more strategic. It was about maintaining control over their colonies. And it's kind of crazy to think that our internet today still depends on that network of cables laid out so long ago.
Oh yeah, for sure. And we see this happening today too. Think about Meta's To Africa project, this big plan to lay a cable around Africa to connect the whole continent.
Hmm.
And they talk about connecting the unconnected right, bringing digital access to everyone. Sounds good, but you also have to think about their motives. They're a business after all. So are they really just trying to expand their reach, get more people using their products? Some people call it digital colonization, spreading their influence and dominance through technology.
It makes you look at the origins of the internet differently, too. Created by the U.S. Department of Defense for universities to share information, but also tied up with the Cold War and the race against Russia for technological superiority. Even things like Cheesy's CyberSyn project, which aim to use technology to manage their economy. There's this definite link between the development of technology and military or strategic goals.
That's right. The pursuit of profit, of power, of information, it all pushes technology forward. And those changes have a huge impact on how we work, how we organize, how we deal with struggles, how society is structured. It's a crucial area to study in digital ethnography.
Okay, so let's talk about a real-world example. The lecture notes mention Miriam's 2015 study of migrants in Morocco. What was she looking at, and how did digital ethnography help her?
She was studying their everyday lives and rituals, including their participation in those International Labor Day rallies. And in that context, social media was really important. It became this tool for individual migrants and for the whole movement to organize and mobilize. They used online platforms to get things coordinated, to share info, to build solidarity.
And her research methods sound really interesting. She didn't just focus on the online stuff, did she?
No, she combined observing online discussions in Facebook groups with being there at the actual protests. It's that idea of embeddedness, understanding social reality by being part of it both online and offline. She met these migrants at the demonstrations, people who had come from the Ivory Coast and DRC to work as cleaners and were part of the labor union. She kept in touch with them through social media and did interviews. She was particularly interested in the issues of race and gender within the migrant rights movement.
So social media wasn't just about organizing protests for these migrants.
Right. It was like a lifeline for them. They used it for logistics, like online maps and stuff, to help them navigate and get to different cities, but also to connect with their families back home to get support, to share info. But there's a risk to all that leaving those digital trails that could be tracked.
And that brings us to the issue of surveillance and space technologies. It was in the notes, too.
Yeah. What Miriam found was that the same technologies migrants rely on, GPS, mobile networks, the internet, can also be used by governments and other organizations to monitor them and even make things harder for them. It's a double bind. These tools help them, but also make them more vulnerable. The notes even compared it to how technology is used for surveillance in other parts of the world, like Palestine. Technology can be a tool for both connection and control.
So in Miriam's studies, social media becomes this really complex thing. It connects migrants, gives them crucial information, maybe even helps them get to Europe, but at the same time, it exposes them to more surveillance and control.
Exactly. It shows both the potential and the risks that come with being online, especially for marginalized groups.
You know, something else came up in the lecture notes about the different terms we use. Sometimes you hear ethnography, online ethnography, and digital ethnography, and it seems like they're used interchangeably. Is one term preferred over the others?
Yeah, that's a good point. Although they overlap a lot, people are starting to use digital ethnography more often, particularly when they're looking at things from a political and economic perspective, especially if they're using that decolonization lens we talked about. It usually means they're taking a deeper look at the power structures and the history that shape online spaces. And our source material reminds us that we can find elements of ethnography in other types of digital research too, like in a study about queer youth Christianity and how they interact in Facebook groups. Ethnographic principles are really useful for understanding life online.
So really getting a handle on the relationship between migrants and social media, like in Miriam's research, means we need to keep exploring how it can be both empowering and disempowering at the same time. It's a good place to start wrapping things up.
Absolutely. Looking back at all these different perspectives on digital ethnography makes it super clear that understanding online communities goes way beyond just watching what people do online. We have to look at the power structures, the historical context, how technology influences everything. It's not just about the surface.
And that brings us to a really interesting question for you, the listener. If our digital footprints are both a lifeline and a vulnerability, how does that change the way we think about community, about who we are, even about how we resist? It makes you think about the ethics of studying these online spaces and the responsibility that comes with it.
This deep dive into digital ethnography is really just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah.
There are so many online communities and cultures and all these new technologies emerging, so many things to explore through this lens. The question is, what will you choose to dive into next?